Good. You can see everything there, all right?
Yeah, it looks good.
Perfect.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Building Your Wellbeing Toolkit webinar. I'm Dion Holness. I'm the current Cultural Outreach Officer for National SAVMA. And my role is to help put together events such as these and go to DEI-focused events and kind of bring that information back to the SAVMA delegates that can then be spread out to all of us in vet school. Just before I introduce our wonderful speaker, for those that are the first 30 registrants, we'll send out a forum so that everybody can sign up at the end of this meeting, just so that we have information on who attended. And then we'll correlate who has signed up here and who were the first 30 registrants, and we'll email you if you're a winner. Okay. So our speaker, Angie Arora, is a social worker who has worked at the cross-section of animal health and humans relationship for over 18 years, specializing in veterinary well-being, end-of-life and pet loss support, and equity issues within the profession. As a well-being coach and certified compassion fatigue specialist, Angie uses a trauma-informed approach to help animal care professionals foster self and community connection so they can reconnect to their work in a new and improved ways. She served on the inaugural board of directors for the International Association of Veterinary Social Work, volunteers with the International Association for Animal Hospice and Palliative Care, and is actively involved in other relevant veterinary medicine initiatives, including Blend, a DEIB certification for veterinary teams. Angie is a professor with Seneca College's School of Community Service, where she developed and teaches a micro-credential aimed at improving the stress response for those within veterinary and shelter medicine. She speaks at conferences across North America, advocating for trauma-informed responses to foster deeper well-being across the profession. And without further ado, I'll hand it over to Miss Angie Arora.
Thank you so much. You know, every single time I try to shorten and tighten my bio, and it always feels like it takes way too long. Anyways, a great warm welcome to everyone. My guess is that people are probably logging in from across the US. Really quickly in the chat, if you just want to tell us where you're from, it'd be kind of nice to see. I think we've got, how many folks do we have here? I'm losing track of numbers here. I think close to 100. Awesome. So yeah, that's great. Yay, I was just in Philadelphia a few weeks ago. As you're all typing, I'll just share a little bit about me in terms of my location. So I'm actually from Toronto, Canada. So I'm probably the only person not from the States on. But I just want to also share that even though a lot of my experience is in Canada, like the issues that are happening in vet med are very similar across North America. So keep them coming. You might find other people that are close by to you. Okay, let's get into it. So one thing that I want to do before we actually get into the kind of the crux of the conversation, I know I'm asking you to chat, but now I'm probably going to ask you to step back for a moment. Each of us is coming into this session, I'm going to say this evening because it's Eastern for me, so it's around 6 o'clock, quite likely coming from doing a bunch of other things. And if I'm reading your reality correctly, you're probably spending most of your days multitasking, right? I want you, if at all possible, to take this next hour for yourself. You may be sitting in a place where there's lots of distractions, but if there's anything that you can do to put aside those distractions and really kind of just focus, we're kind of designed as humans to be able to do one thing at a time, and you've probably been really stretched already today. Most of you, it looks like you have your cameras off, so you're probably going to feel comfortable with this next exercise, but we're not going to spend much time here. I'm going to do this for you just as much as it's for me. If you're comfortable, you can lower your gaze or close your eyes, and we're just going to be here for just a few moments. And just think about if you have given your breath any attention today. And it's quite likely that we haven't, and that's okay. But let's use these moments to just center in on our breath. Sometimes when people are doing this, they find it helpful to either hold their belly or place a hand over their heart, their chest, palms up in the air, whatever works for you. And I don't want you to change your breath just yet. I just want you to notice it. And just notice if it's running a bit shallow. Or maybe you do have some deep breaths going on. And just pay attention to what is without having to change it. And just while you're sitting here, if you can also start to draw your attention to just areas around your body where you may be holding a little bit of tension. Maybe it's in your jaw or your forehead. It could be in your shoulders, your hands. And we're just going to use a few deep, gentle breaths to start to bring some slowness into our body. And I'll let you count at whatever pace feels comfortable, but take some deep breaths in and make sure that your exhale is longer than your inhale. And just a couple more moments here. If there's anything that you need to do to start to bring a bit more comfort into your body, maybe that's doing a quick stretch, a big yawn, another few deep breaths. I'll just let you do that before we come back together. And if you're comfortable, you can now open your eyes and we're going to get back into it. And that didn't really, take a whole lot of time, but maybe you're feeling a slight difference in your body from when we started to even just 30 seconds to a minute later. Okay. So here is what is on our agenda for the next hour. We're going to set the context. And what I mean by that is, those of you that obviously you registered, you saw that we were going to be talking about something called self-regulation. And I want to set a little bit of context into why that is the tool that I want to focus on for today. I'm going to go through some really common terminology that's being used in vet med right now, making sure that we have a very accurate and clear understanding what this language is. For example, you've probably heard about burnout and compassion fatigue. I want to really quickly break down that language so that we're all walking away with an accurate shared understanding of what that means. You can expect that the first probably 20 to 25 minutes is going to be on the context. And then we're going to spend the last half hour talking about self-regulation as a tool. And of course, we'll leave some time for a discussion as well. Okay, so really briefly, I'm not going to go beyond what was already shared. That's the little me on that side and then the bigger me on the other side. And these are both of my babies that really both got me into this work and have kept me in this work. So that was Monty on the left, and that was me, I think, when I was 6 years old. And that's Enzo on the right. And my sweet Enzo just passed a few months ago. And so when I look at this, it just it warms my heart. He's kind of propelling me into this next layer of my work. And I just wanted to give them a little bit of credit. The other thing I wanted to mention is I've worked in vet med as a social worker, not the way you are, right? So I recognize that there's some really big differences, but I've been working in vet med for close to 18 years. I've worked inside a hospital as a veterinary social worker. And the one piece that I want to mention from that is in a really short stint, I'm talking a year and a half, my first hospital job, I crashed and burned really, really, really hard. And I wasn't even working and treating the patients. I was just helping the people. And I was trained as a social worker, and I crashed and burned. And I am not sharing this to scare people. It's actually quite the opposite. If I had known the things that I know now back then, I wouldn't have crashed and burned. And so we know that there are a ton of stressors in every profession. You've got nuanced ones in yours that we're going to start to talk about. But there is so much hope. There is so much hope. And I don't want us to get stuck or caught in the rhetoric that you're like, that this is all doom and gloom, that you're about to enter a profession that's going to suck the life out of you. That's not what I want us to walk away with. Because when you know the tools on how to cope, and there's systemic change working to change the profession, which quite frankly there is right now, I think that there's a lot of things to look forward to. But I just wanted to mention that I fell deep into compassion fatigue. And so I do have that lived experience of what it feels like. And my hope for you is that you don't ever get there. So before we get into the content, just a few pieces on resources. If you find that any of the information is bringing up stuff for you that you're feeling the need to talk about, there are a few resources here for you to take note of. Sure, especially given the period of time we're in right now with so much awareness happening around suicide prevention. I'm sure many folks have heard of the 988 line. You can check in with your own university or college's counseling services. And I'm sure, my guess is that people have probably started to hear about places like Not One More Vet. Just also sharing a bit of a newer resource called Mentor Vet, which is really meant to support the early career veterinarians with their well-being. And there's like this roster of grads who can be paired with more experienced folks within the profession. So just wanted to leave that there with you. So let's get into the context. All of this terminology about what does it all mean? I'm going to try to keep this really simple because this means nothing to you if it's all fancy academic language. We're going to go through all three, but pretty simply here. Burnout. I wish I could see your faces because I'd be asking you how many of you have heard of this. My guess is that most of you have heard of burnout, and some of you might be experiencing it right now. Okay. In a really, really simple terms, this is when we have it's sort of like the cumulative impact of unmanaged stress. That is a really watered down, simplified definition. In a few minutes, I'm going to break down for you what are considered to be the 6 major causes of burnout. And I want you to start to position yourself as you're hearing this, like, where do I fit in all of this? Right? So again, think of burnout as cumulative stress that's gone left unmanaged. There are a lot of systemic causes to burnout, right? So when we experience burnout, it's not because we're weak. It's not because we're not good enough. It's because the situations or the conditions that we're working in have caused this stress. So this does lead me to say, as much as I'm going to be focusing on one really concrete tool you can do internally, the profession and the educational system within the profession has to also change, right, in order to prevent burnout from happening in the first place. Okay, secondary trauma. In simple terms, again, think of this as my exposure to the pain and suffering of others. And so in vet med, you've got a bit of a double whammy here, because you're exposed to the pain and suffering of the patients, but you're also, if you haven't already, are going to be exposed to the pain and suffering of the clients, the human clients, whether that is through the loss of their pet, end of life, whether it is a client who's coming in to use your services who's experiencing mental health issues, the list can go on. But again, secondary trauma is the exposure to others' pain and suffering. But more than that, it's when the exposure doesn't get dealt with. Because you're joining a profession where there's no two ways about it. You are going to be exposed to pain and suffering. There's many professions around this world that are exposed to pain and suffering, right? I've practiced social work for nearly 2 decades. I've been exposed to pain and suffering and trauma at a really high level. That's not the problem. I mean, We don't want people to suffer, but that's not the root problem here. The bigger issue is, how am I dealing with that exposure? And for people who are coming into this profession, you are very ill-equipped with how to deal with that exposure. So by definition, if you take burnout, the impact of cumulative stress, and the exposure to others' pain and suffering, and if both of those are being unmanaged, that's what can lead to compassion fatigue. Okay, and compassion fatigue, as we're going to talk about shortly, is essentially when you don't lose your compassion, by the way. Many experts have argued you never lose your compassion. You start to put blocks up to your compassion. So it becomes harder to connect with others. And we're going to talk about the phases of compassion fatigue shortly. So I'm going to invite you into the chat again. I could be opening up a can of worms here, but that is okay. What would you say are your biggest stress points right now? Put them in the chat. Okay, so I'm seeing a lot around exams. Okay, lack of personal time due to all that you have to do with schoolwork. Unclear expectations. Being in a place where you're getting yelled at for making mistakes. Red tape within the school system. Again, this comment of not being able to balance, like it probably feels like your whole identity is school right now. Worry about how the public bullies veterinarians in social media. Yeah. So again, a lot on this personal identity. Being away from family, for sure. And again, it's kind of that connection between my academic identity, my professional identity, and my personal identity. Lack of fulfilling my plans. I'm reading this on purpose because it's going to help to inform how we approach the next few issues. Not winning the lottery. Financial stress, right? That's a big one, we know. Okay, so please feel free to keep those coming in the chat. I wanted to share a statistic with you that came out of a pretty recent well-being study. Some of you maybe have heard of it. It's probably the biggest veterinary well-being study that's been done by Merck. And what this is essentially showing is that even though veterinarians and physicians report similar satisfaction with work-life balance, veterinarians still experience a higher level of burnout. Okay, and I'm not surprised, unfortunately, because right now I'm going to take you to what are the conditions of burnout. We use this term really loosely without fully understanding what it means. So I'm just going to give you a minute to take a look at those 6 causes of burnout. And so I now want to take some of the examples that you shared and kind of slot them in. So I heard someone say, or I read someone say, being away from family. That clearly connects to some extent, a loss of community. One of the things that I do hear from students as well, which I think is like a buffer or a promising aspect here, is the type of community you form while you're in vet school. So the new friendships that you're making, those really have value on your well-being. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about that in a bit. I think the most obvious one for you right now is the last one, the work overload. This is the component of burnout that we often think about the most, just being overworked. And so while that is true, and there's no doubt that you are in an academic program that is severely overworking you, there's no two ways about it. I just want us to recognize that other aspects can also contribute to burnout. So when you feel like you have a lack of control in your studying environment or work environment, That actually stands out to me as an example that someone said in the chat, where you're looking for clarity from professors, and instead of getting the clarity, perhaps you're actually feeling like you're being made to feel like you're making mistakes. If that brews on for too long, that can definitely be a contributing factor to burnout. But that really also connects with this idea of lack of fairness. When we're working in environments, in any environment, this is not just vet med, but any environment where we feel like our personal values are in conflict with what we're being asked to do, that is a condition for burnout. I'm going to touch on this. There's actually a name for it, and it's called moral stress or moral injury. And I'm going to talk about that in a moment, because many have argued that this is a really, really massive issue within vet med. Okay, when you're being asked to do things that are in conflict with your values, this could come up, for example, if a client is bringing an animal to you to euthanize when you know that that animal should not be euthanized. This could come up if a vet tech is being asked to implement a treatment plan that they don't inherently agree with, right? There's a lot of moments where this can kind of come up. Insufficient reward, this is definitely more of a systemic issue where, we know the amount of debt that you're incurring as a student. If you're now going out into the field and feeling like, financial reward is only one, but even just being recognized for your work and not getting that over time. So when you start to add these together, we can see that there are many layers and complexity to what burnout looks like in vet med. Something to just note, these are the telltale signs of burnout. Your energy starts to go away. You start to become really cynical. That's one thing that I've noticed in vet med a lot, that dark humor becomes a bit of a coping mechanism. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, but when it's leading to you're finding the negative in everything, again, there's no judgment on it. It makes sense why it's happening, but it is a telltale sign that something deeper might be happening. Okay, like I said, we want to go through these quickly so we can spend time on the tools. Just a quick note on moral stress. I just want to emphasize this. If you have not heard this term before, you will hear it throughout your career. In simple terms, my personal values are in conflict with what's in front of me. I'm being asked to do something that does not feel right. I don't know the extent to which this is coming up for you now, but it is going to come up in practice. Okay, and this is why building our well-being toolkit is so important to mitigate some of these stressors. We mentioned earlier that secondary traumatic stress is the exposure to the pain and suffering of others. Just really proactively, although you may not be experiencing this yet, if you're aware of it before you start practicing, it helps. It helps because you're now starting to know what to look out for. So with secondary traumatic stress, what we often find is that people start replaying traumatic or painful experiences over and over and over again. And the reality is that you've probably experienced this in your personal life if you've ever experienced trauma of any sort, right? So the replaying is our body's way of trying to process or make sense of what's happened. When we haven't been able to release and kind of integrate that exposure, it gets trapped inside of us. From my vantage point, looking at vet med for close to 2 decades, I believe, really in my heart of hearts, that this is where a lot of the issues lie. That we are throwing you into a profession where you are exposed to trauma at incredibly high rates, but we are not teaching you the tools on how to feel it, how to process it, and how to release it. We're going to do a little bit of that today. When your worldview starts to shift, that's when you know that secondary traumatic stress is probably kicked in. I'm going to give you one really clear example here. I was doing a lot of pet loss bereavement support, especially when I was working in the hospital setting and even beyond. I was the type of people that would end up speaking with me were often the people who had no supports in their own individual lives. That's why they came to me. If you have supportive family and friends, you don't usually need to come to a counselor. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. And we know that with pet loss, there's so much of a stigma that it's hard to find counselors who are going to get it anyways. But I was exposed to really traumatic losses of people's pets, right? Like, for example, and I'll share a couple of graphic examples here, so just be warned, but you know, the person's walking down the street with their dog on the leash and a transit bus runs by and runs over their dog. Like that level of trauma. And I was exposed to the trauma on a daily basis over and over and over again. And at that early stage of my career, I didn't know what to do with that. Like, what do I do being exposed to all of this? I had no real idea on how to process it, to even feel it. In fact, I thought I wasn't supposed to feel it. Like, just keep your stuff over there. I'm going to create some sort of a barrier so I don't feel it. But the reality is, no matter how you slice it, you've been exposed. We have to do something to release it because otherwise it gets trapped inside. The telltale sign for me that I was experiencing this was I would come home waiting for my pets to be dead because all I was exposed to was dead animals. And I remember there was one client in particular who had accidentally left the dryer open. Her cat got in. You know where this went. And for years, I would double, triple, quadruple check my dryer to a point of it being unhealthy. That's secondary traumatic stress. Okay. So coming now back to remember that when you have conditions of burnout and secondary traumatic stress happening together, that can lead to what's called compassion fatigue. I'm going to kind of go through this relatively quickly because I'm cautious of time. But you start your work, whether that's studying or at a new position, like ready to go. I am excited, I am all in, I am enthusiastic, and I'm hopeful. Then things start to creep in. I start to get more irritable. Listen, some of you are probably feeling this right now because you're stretched so thin. You don't have the capacity to show up in the ways that you want to all the time. So the irritability starts to kick in. You start to get snippy with your friends, with your family, with your partner, with your kids. And then eventually it starts to trickle into your relationships at work. If left unmanaged, people will withdraw because that becomes a coping mechanism. To withdraw means to avoid. To withdraw means to numb. We have an entire profession that is numbing at an incredibly high rate. Again, no judgment. You're numbing because you don't have the tools on how to process it. And then for many people, or for some people, I should say, that will leave them leaving the profession. Because now you're just walking around in zombie mode and there's nothing left and I just can't do it anymore. So what we're trying to do is prevent some of these things from happening. So let's get into the tool of self-regulation. Okay. And I want to be just, before I jump into it, I just want to be clear. This tool in and of itself is not going to solve all your problems. It is just one tool to factor into your tool belt. In my opinion, it is probably one of the most fundamental tools because with this, you can then start to integrate other tools on top of it. So the World Health Organization defines mental health and mental well-being as a state of well-being in which a person realizes their own abilities, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively, fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. The piece that I want to just pull out from here, because this is where self-regulation really comes in, is can cope with the normal stresses of life. Let's substitute this with can cope with the expected stresses of vet bed. I wish I could take away all the stress. I wish you knew that you could take away all the stress, but we can't. It is a stressful profession. It is. But your why on why you joined this profession supersedes that. And if you're not clear on your why, like you might know it in your heart of hearts, but if you've never written out your why, I would so encourage you to write it out. Like, why are you here? Why have you chosen to do this work? We all know it's because you love animals. Can you dig deeper with that? Because when things get tough and rough, that why needs to be able to hold you down. right? So what we're going to focus on is one tool that you can use to help cope with the expected stressors of vet med. I'm a firm believer that we achieve well-being by not only just caring for ourselves, because I am going to be introducing you to a more micro individual tool, but also how we show up and care for each other. Because if we look at cultures around the world, the majority of cultures around the world are what we call collective-based cultures. People's well-being thrives based on the well-being of the people around them. It's kind of like that phrase, you know, I'm probably going to say it wrong, but it takes a village to raise a child. That's the mentality, right? For many of us, we've been raised in cultures where, like, I'm not supposed to do this hard stuff alone. But here in a North American context, it's kind of individualized survival of the fittest and, you know, like work hard, work hard, work hard. That's how you achieve success. I just want to mention, don't take for granted the really solid friendships, relationships that you're building with your colleagues over your time in vet school, because that's where a lot of the collective care can come up as well. I also just want to draw attention to that there are so many factors that shape how we show up to care for ourselves. And we've all been raised differently, right? For some of us, culture plays a really big role in how we've learned to take care of ourselves, or now how not to take care of ourselves, both ways, right? The family that you grew up in, how you saw people, your parents take care of themselves or not, subtly starts to shape it. But I think that you're coming into vet med at a really fascinating time where this is starting to become not only discussed, but almost somewhat starting to slow shift to integrating well-being tools within practice. This is the theme of our next 20 more minutes of content. We cannot think our way through stress. We have to feel our way through it. And this may not be something that you want to hear, and this may not be something that you want to do. But the science and the research behind this is becoming more and more clear. What I am going to share with you is not kind of like this spiritual hoo-ha stuff. And I'm not saying that can't be important, but like I'm going to share with you physiology of the body and why we need to be doing certain things. We have MRI studies coming out showing that when people feel and process their emotions, it actually starts to take the edge off the stress within the body. Accumulated stress, what does it do to your body? You have adrenaline and cortisol running through your body. If that is not being discharged or released from your body in a healthy way, it builds up inside, and that leads to chronic inflammation. Chronic inflammation it wreaks havoc on your system, as we're going to see. So when I say that we have to feel our way through it, I'm actually not only talking about emotions, I'm talking about the sensations in your body. Like where you've got that big lump in your throat, where you've got a constriction in your chest, where you've got this massive headache that you can't shake. That's the stuff we've got to learn to sit with, and I'm going to explain why. So, self-regulation, in very simple terms, is the ability to notice and process your body's sensations, emotions, and thoughts when you're stressed. When you start to increase your capacity to do this, the stressor itself may not disappear, but what you're doing is you're learning how to better manage your own reactions and behaviors. Because for so many of us, we get set off by something, and our reaction is not how we actually want to react. We almost can't control it. My partner says one thing to me, and it's like, oh, and I explode. That's not how I want to live my life. And so this is where self-regulation becomes really important. We are designed, or as you know, I mean, you're studying this in animals, but we are designed to have a stress response. That means something happens that causes me to feel threatened in some way, shape, or form. I react, I feel it, and then what? When we think about many or certain animals, like I'm going to use a really simplistic example of a dog. When a dog has been stressed in some way, shape, or form, what do dogs sometimes do to get that stress out of their body? Like, I'll think of an example where I used to give my dog a bath, and he would be shaking right before the bath because he hated water and was like petrified of water. And he'd obviously have to go through the bath because he had no choice. But after the bath, what do a lot of dogs do? Put it in the chat or raise your hand. I don't care. Yeah, so stress yawn might be one, like when they like give that big yawn. Yeah, exactly. They may go to the washroom. They shake and run around like they do the zoomies, right? They'll just kind of run around in circles. That's actually their body's way of releasing and discharging that energy from their body. Animals have somehow managed to keep that ending of the stress response in their systems, and they use it. Twitching, shaking, running, yawning. As humans, this is something that is currently being explored by research. But as humans, we are evolving very differently. We have somehow managed to block the end of our stress response. And for many of us, we are walking around every single day in these chronic activated states where we are not releasing the cortisol, we are not releasing the adrenaline, and it's just getting trapped within the cells of our body. So let's get into it. I'm going to approach this from two different angles, and I'm going to go through it relatively quickly. Okay, so I'm going to try to get right to the point. One is called an acute response to stress, and then the other is like practices that you want to start to integrate into your life every single day. What I mean by this is people have probably heard of fight, flight, freeze. Those are our nervous system activated states. And I'm going to touch on them right now. Okay, so actually, let's just go there. The first step of being able to learn how to self-regulate is to know what activated state you're in. So if we think of our central nervous system as like the central command system of our body, it's where the messages from our body travel to our brain, and the messages of the brain travel to the body through the nervous system. Within the nervous system, one part of that is called the autonomic nervous system, the ANS. And as many of you may know, the ANS is responsible for all things automatic in your body. So your breath, your heart rate, your ability to go to the bathroom, your gut, all those things, right? Your blood pressure, your blood sugar levels, everything that's just meant, your circadian rhythm, everything that's just meant to happen normally and naturally flows through there. Within the autonomic nervous system, we've got two different branches. We have the sympathetic branch and the parasympathetic branch. I'm a social worker. I don't get into the science of a lot of this. I know as much as I need to. So I'm not going to get too technical into this, other than to say that when our body is experiencing a threat or a perceived threat, we move into one of these three things. We move into fight or flight or freeze. I'm going to come to fawn later. Fight means that I'm leaning towards the threat. I'm trying to defend myself. So if a bear is chasing me, I'm not running away. I'm running towards it. Probably not a great example, but you know what I mean. I'm preparing to defend. Flight is when I'm moving away from the threat. And you know as well as I do, we need these threat responses to survive. There is nothing wrong about these. We need them. That's how we've evolved. That's how we've managed to keep ourselves alive, right? And here, if fight or flight doesn't feel safe to someone in the moment, then what happens is you move into freeze. So for example, again, not the most pleasant of examples, so I will warn you before I say it. If we think about survivors of violence and survivors of abuse, some people will say, well, why didn't they just leave? Why didn't they just get out of the situation? Why did they let that happen to themselves? There's actually something physiologically going on here, something that's beyond someone's mind control. This is not about what's happening in our brains. This is about what's happening in our bodies. It didn't feel safe for me to fight back because I knew they'd fight back 10 times harder. I couldn't run away because if I ran away, they would chase me and then beat me even more. So what does my body tell me to do? Freeze. So freeze kicks in when neither of these feel safe. Learning about the nervous system and nervous system regulation takes months and years. I have about another 10 minutes with you. So I can't go into this in an enormous amount of depth, but even if all you do is learn to identify what response you're in and learn to tune into your body, what you are starting to do, whether you realize it or not, you are actually starting to increase what's called your window of tolerance. Your window of tolerance to sit with the uncomfortable sensations. And as you start to increase your window of tolerance to sit with the uncomfortable situations, you are going to notice so much positive change because you will be less reactionary. You will be less jumpy. And there's actually a whole lot of stuff that's happening in your body in which your nervous system is actually, you're giving your nervous system what it wants. Okay, that probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense yet, but I hope it will soon. I would love if you could, like, I don't know if you can, I'm cool with you having access to these slides because you can just kind of come back and read these at your own time. Because fight and flight, it's the same branch of your nervous system that's being activated, you're going to notice similar physiological impacts. So the increased heart rate, your mouth might go dry, your face might start to go red, you might start to feel muscle tension, you might start to sweat. Those are all fight and flight responses. The thing is, you have to be able to discern, not just from the physical sensations, but what is your body asking you to do? Is it asking you to fight or fight? Fight or flight? So again, sorry, I'm just jumping here because I realize I'm probably a little bit behind on time. In freeze mode, your body is kind of doing the opposite. It's starting to demobilize because it's saving up all the energy that it can to survive the threat in the moment. So this is where you feel the decreased heart rate, you start to feel numb. A telltale sign of freeze mode is your brain starts to go really, really foggy and you can't think clearly. All of this to say, these work when there is an actual threat in front of us. However, over time, our bodies are now reacting to the smallest things the same way that they would react to a bear chasing us. Our nervous systems have not evolved, and I don't think they ever can, to be able to discern the level of threat. A threat is a threat is a threat. So this is where our childhood stuff starts to come up. The traumas that we've experienced in our lives start to come up because my body has conditioned itself based on my past life experiences. So if I grew up as this is a very oversimplistic example, but if I grew up in a home where I was told to be quiet, shut up, not cry, don't show my true self, because if you do, there's going to be trouble. Maybe I've learned that to avoid is the safest thing for me. And if that's what I've learned and I've been conditioned over my, childhood, teenage years into my adulthood, that this is kind of my default mode, you don't magically unlearn it. You have to work to unlearn it. And that's where nervous system work comes in. So what was a real threat growing up has now, your body now treats your partner telling you what to do with the same level of intensity. And all of that has been built up into our nervous system over the years. Okay. I'm not going to touch on fawning today. Let's just keep it simple. So the first and the hardest part, because I've been doing this work for years on myself, and I'm still working on it. This does not happen overnight. You're not going to wake up tomorrow and be like, yep, I'm in fight mode. Yay, I'm all healed. This is like repeated work that we have to consistently come back to. Here's why. When you know which state you're activated in, you got to give your body what it needs. Remember how so much in the beginning I was talking about we don't know how to release? This is it. So if your body is jumping into fight mode, the goal here, I know this is going to sound really strange, But the goal of nervous system work is not necessarily to reach a state of calm. That's not what nervous system work is. Nervous system work is either discharging the energy from your body, bringing energy back into your body, depending on which state you're in, and learning to sit with the uncomfortable sensations. Too often, what are we doing? Something uncomfortable happens, we numb it. I'll go onto my phone and I'll doom scroll for like 2 hours. I'll turn to the wine. That'll take the edge off. I'll watch Netflix for a few hours so I don't have to think about anything. Those are okay in doses, but especially in this profession, if you don't learn how to sit with it and release it, I can promise you, mark my words, it is going to catch up. Because that's what's happening to the profession right now. So what can you do? In fight mode, your body wants to defend. Your body wants to act. It's got energy that needs to be discharged. So give your body what it wants. You're going to have to obviously use your judgment here on what you can do, when, where, and how. But as an example, these are just examples. If you're feeling like you need to punch someone, don't punch someone. Don't cause harm to anyone else or any objects. But if you punch the air, that doesn't hurt anybody. And you're releasing the energy from your body. This is not stuff we're taught. Your body wants to cry, you let it cry, because that's what it needs to complete the stress response. Your body wants to laugh, let it laugh, because that's what it needs to complete the stress response. So what I find is that sometimes, what I find sometimes here is that physical exercise can also be really helpful. You probably aren't going to have a lot of time, but even if you can just run to the washroom after, like, let's just say you got into an argument with somebody or somebody just pissed you off, run into the washroom for 2 minutes and do 20 squats, something to just get the energy out, okay? For some people, breath work helps a lot here. And I just want you to be careful that if you're focusing on breath work and trying to integrate that into your life, the type of breath work that you need if you're in fight mode is different than the type of breath you need that if your body is in freeze. So again, hang on to these slides so you can come back and refer to them. The key thing to know is that if your body's in fight mode and you want to use your breath to regulate yourself, just make sure that your exhale is longer than your inhale. And there's just a physiological reason for it that we're not going to get into today. All right, if you have a tendency to avoid and run away from the perceived threat or stressor, your body is trying to run away. Is it possible to give it a little bit of it what it wants? Can you go for a walk? Can you go for a run to get away from the situation that's causing you stress? But you're still releasing the energy. Other tips to consider here is if we have a tendency to avoid, we're not really feeling and processing. So can you start to increase your capacity to sit with the discomfort for a little bit longer? This is what I was talking about before, the window of tolerance. So if your heart is beating really, really fast, don't slow it down. Sit with what that feels like. I know it can be a bit uncomfortable. If you are somebody who struggles with anxiety, don't do this. If you struggle with anxiety, don't sit with the discomfort because it will not feel safe to do so. Instead, if you're able to work with a trained coach or therapist who can help you learn how to slowly build your window of tolerance, that is the route to go. So that's just a bit of a disclaimer here. If you have a tendency to move into freeze, I know this was me for a long time. I would just freeze up. Like even if I was just getting into an argument with a family member, I would just freeze up. I couldn't think clearly. What you're trying to do here is bring energy back into your body. Your body doesn't need to expend energy. It needs to get energy going again. So here are a couple of breathwork techniques that you can Google and look up. One is called the VU breathing technique, but I'm going to just gently add a comment in here that while this breathwork can be incredibly useful, from what I have learned, the VU technique is very similar to an ancient Tibetan practice that's called the Mu breathwork. So we have to be careful on how some of this content has been culturally appropriated over the years. With that being said, what happens when you do moo and voo is there's some science and that shows that it starts to mobilize the energy. You might start to feel some movement come back into your body. Again, this is all just planting seeds for you to go out and further research. Many of us tend to get very overwhelmed when we're in freeze mode. So the trick here is to try to just focus on one thing you can do at a time. You go into your kitchen, it's full of 100 dishes and you don't know where to start. Focus on one thing you can do, not all of it. Okay, I'm going to skip on for now. As I've mentioned, over time, not right now, over time, we want to build our capacity to sit with the sensations of each activated response. Okay, so I'm going to do this part very quickly. I'm always overly ambitious in what I think I can get into an hour, always. So those are all things to consider for activated responses. Just one word of caution. If you want to be able to lean into breath work when you're in an activated state, your body, it's not going to feel natural. So the thing to remember is you want to do, I'm going to go back here for a moment, all these things when you're actually in a state of regulation. So what I do is I focus on my breath work throughout the day when I'm feeling like this. I'm like this. Because that's what you have to create a bit of safety with the tool. Your body is not going to instinctively go to the breath work. But if you've practiced the breath work over and over and over again, when you're regulated, it's easier to pull that tool when you're dysregulated. Okay. Then you've got what's called nervous system hygiene. This is like, what are you building into every single day? I'm not going to go into a rant about this, although I could. You have to meet your body's most basic needs. Drinking water, eating food, going to the washroom. And I know a lot of you are sacrificing these because it's just too busy. I'm going to tell you from a nervous system perspective, you're causing dysregulation in your body. Forget about your emotions in your brain. You're actually causing dysregulation in your nervous system. You are teaching your body not to trust its most basic needs. So see what you can do there. The more you can learn to be in your body and less, it kind of takes you away from up here. This is why you will, as a coach and a therapist, I will not start people into mind work. I start in the body because this is where everything lives. Learn to pay attention to the sensations. I feel like I've said that 100 times, so I'll stop there. Finally, have some sort of daily practice for yourself. Okay, and again, these are the types of things that if you can learn to do on the daily, your body will more naturally turn to them when you're dysregulated. Okay, we've talked about some of the breath work. Grounding exercises can be fabulous for people who experience a lot of anxiety. Every single day, bring some easeful movement into your day. I'm not talking, you can do the hardcore exercise, but can you dance? Can you stretch? Can you walk? Can you tighten up your muscles and then release them? Again, come back to the body. We know that there are tons of benefits of being outside and with nature. I won't go into it, probably heard this before. It is, being in nature is phenomenal for your nervous system. And learning how to self-soothe. And this is where weighted blankets have become so popular because it's actually a form of self-soothing, but you don't need to buy anything to do it. Hum to yourself, sing when you're by yourself. I always have my hands over my heart because it just makes me feel good. The things that just make you feel safe. Babies know how to do this. We've all been born in a way of knowing how to we learn how to self-soothe. And then as adults, that gets ripped away from us. So let's bring it back. If you're looking to dig deeper into nervous system work, this is one person who I would highly recommend. She's got a lot of free educational material on her YouTube videos. She gives away tons of toolkits. She's a great person to start with. I rushed that, I'm so sorry, but here is my contact info if anybody wants to stay in touch. I'll just draw attention to my Instagram handle down here. I try to share quite a bit of tidbits on this regularly. So if you want to follow me on Instagram, you'll get some expanded versions of some of the things that we were talking about.